Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. In the previous video, we looked at how the defer block allows us to load components lazily even on the same page. In today's video, we are going to take it one step forward. We're going to discuss about hydration, how this works in Angular, and how incremental hydration takes everything to the max level. But first thing first, if you have not cloned the repository yet or not watched the previous videos, I would highly encourage to look at them right now, and then you can find the link to the code in the description of the video. Once you go there, you can basically fork it or just copy the code from here, do a git clone, then you can quickly open that into your favorite editor. I'm going to use VS Code here. Once you do so, make sure to check out the right branch. So you can do git checkout, and here you can say hydration-start. Once you do so, you can just run npm install to install the dependencies and then run ng-serve-no-hmr. You may want to have Angular CLI installed within your machine, so make sure that you have Angular CLI installed. So you may want to run npm install-d at angular/CLI. Once you do so, you can simply run ng-serve-no-hmr. Once you have done that, you can essentially go to your browser and refresh, and you should be able to see the application working. Now, in the previous video, we discussed already how we can use the defer block to lazily load a component, and we ended up doing that by going to our app, and in here we have the products page, and inside the products HTML, we have this defer block, which only renders the products list when the products are ready. Now, instead of doing this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to viewport. So here we can say on viewport, which means that they're not going to be rendered until the user goes to the particular section where the placeholder is going to be shown anyways. Now, when I go to the browser, I can essentially go to the Angular extension, and here I can see that we have the app root, we have the app products, and here we are just showing a placeholder. If I scroll down, you will see that this placeholder is here. Now it's going to run some heavy computation, and then you can see that the products list gets rendered right here. I can click a particular add to cart button and I can see the title, which is right here. Now you can also see the same thing with the elements tab as well. If I refresh now, you will see that we don't see the logs of the heavy computation. If I go to the elements, I could also see that inside main, app products, and this section, we have just this placeholder being shown. Another good way of looking at it, as discussed in the previous video, is just right click here, go to view page source, and then do line wrap. And in here, you can see that we have this particular placeholder that is being shown right here. Now, the difference between having hydration or no hydration is that when you use hydration, it will not destroy the whole HTML when the server-side rendered content comes to the browser and the browser has to render it. Usually what happens without hydration is that you render something on the server, then you essentially get it on the client, and then Angular has to rebuild the whole DOM structure once again, because Angular runs then obviously on the client as well and then has to rebuild it. Now, there are two benefits to it, or two use cases here. One, that the server-side rendering is usually used for SEO, so for search crawlers or web crawlers, so to say. So everyone who's gonna search for a particular content in your website will be able to find easily that. But when an actual user is using your application, your code would still be server-side rendered, but when it comes to the client, then Angular would kick in and then it would have to rebuild all of those things. Now, what actually happens here is it ends up having bad user experience, also lesser code web vitals or poor core web vitals, and bad SEO in general when your server ends up providing you HTML, but your client is still, or your browser is still doesn't show that well. So even though you improve SEO to some extent with SSR, you still have this problem that the user doesn't really see your content and has the HTML being destroyed, or you have layout shift because it's going to try to remove stuff, bring that back again, which would cause layout shift, of course, resulting in bad SEO. So in this case, if I go to Lighthouse, let's quickly have a run and see how does it look like so far. All right, so here you can see that we have good SEO, but we have very bad performance, or it's not as good. So 78 is not a good number. And here you can see that the issues are speed index. We have first contentful paint, largest contentful paint, and then total blocking time as well. Now, if I go down here, you're going to see that when it comes to the sequence of the elements, you see that there comes a point where the HTML has to be re-rendered. So it doesn't look as bad, but essentially the HTML is destroyed and then re-rendered again. Now what we are going to do is we are going to use hydration. So one of the things that I think can make it easier for understanding hydration is that it's like a handshake, that the server renders something and then the browser takes it from there, so to say. So here I'm going to quickly refresh and show you this is how it looks. We do have the placeholder here, then we have some link tags here, and then we don't have anything here, but we're going to now enable hydration. So we're going to go to our code here and we're going to go to app.py config.ts, and in here, after all these cool things, we are quickly going to go and say provide client hydration quickly. Now we can save this, and now if I go back to my browser and refresh here, you're going to see something interesting. Now not only we have the placeholder, but we also have this thing called ngState, and you can see there's a JSON in here. This JSON is really helpful for containing information that the browser can take and continue from there to render the particular component. And there are a bunch of instructions here that we are not going to go into, but if I try to do the Lighthouse run again, let's see what happens. So this was 78, 100, 191. If I quickly try this again, you can see that it immediately went to 90 just by using hydration. And this is just one run. I would encourage you to try it out. And I mentioned this previously in my videos as well. I don't really trust Lighthouse as much in terms of how accurate this is, because even with the same machine, if I have more RAM that is being used by some other processes or CPU, it's going to give me different results. And that's why in production, we try to run multiple passes of Lighthouse runs, and then we take the average of it. Anyways, you can try this and see what kind of difference does it make. So now you can see that in this particular case, we do have the first contentful paint in 0.9 seconds, the largest contentful paint in just 1.3 seconds. And in here, you can also see the result as well. So this is pretty nice. By just using hydration, Angular did not have to recreate all the DOM elements. It just used what server provided us and then continued from there. Now, one thing that you're gonna notice that something did not change, and that is that we did have the placeholder, this placeholder element rendering on the server, but this was the same with defer, and this was the same with hydration as well. But we can go one level up. What if instead of rendering this placeholder, and right now this is below the fold, so to say, so when I scroll down, then basically you can see that we see start heavy computation and then the products are actually loaded. But what if my products were already there? What if the products were not below the fold, or they were actually right here? If I use defer in that particular case, then what would happen? It would essentially load the dependency then, and if it's coming from the server, then we would just have a placeholder. So imagine that there's just a placeholder for the products here. The products are not shown, but I actually want the server to render the products, and the main content should be products that come from the server, and then from the client side, it essentially just takes from there. I don't even want the client side to show a loading indicator or hydrate, so to say, or basically do the same thing here. For example, if the server theoretically shows a loader and then actually renders the product and then sends it back to me, then I don't really want the loader to show up here again and then load everything. I should just be able to render those products right there and just take it from there. I don't have to do the same thing again. That is the whole point of hydration, that it should send some data from the server to the browser. So the browser has the state of what should be rendered, what is the data that's required, and just takes it from there. So it doesn't have to do the same thing twice. That is where incremental hydration comes in. But before going there, with hydration, there are a few gotchas. One of the biggest things is that with hydration, you need to avoid a couple of things. There are some constraints. So you should avoid any direct DOM manipulation, which means you should avoid using the document object model to do append child, inner HTML, outer HTML for the content that you want to basically hydrate. So that is one of the recommendations or constraints, so to say. Then also you should have valid HTML structure, otherwise it's not going to work. So you should have, for example, a table that has a T body, no tables without T bodies. There should not be any anchor text inside anchor text, so on and so forth. I would just encourage you to look into the documentation itself and see what the constraints are. But one more thing that I did not show you with hydration is that with hydration turned on, if you go to the Angular extension, you can actually see which components are hydrated. In our case, the whole application is hydrated eventually, but this is the products page which is hydrated. So when the product page is hydrated, it essentially means that the HTML inside the products page is hydrated. You will see that the app products list is not hydrated here, and that is because this was never coming from the server. So the products list component wasn't coming from the server, so that's why it doesn't really hydrate, so to say. Now you can also use this show hydration overlays to see this was hydrated, which is the products page, and of course you will see other components which are hydrated as well when you turn on the overlay. But having said that, what would happen if I don't really want to hydrate a component, or I want to say skip hydration, which means that it will not continue from where the server left and it would still be done again from Angular. So in that regard, what we could do is we could quickly go ahead and go to the component that we don't want to be hydrated. So we are going to go to products, for example, here, and here we can go ahead and say we're going to have this host attribute, and in here we are going to quickly go ahead and say ngSkipHydration, and we are going to just go ahead and say true here, or you can essentially wrap this inside the quotations just like this and save. And I made a mistake here, so it should be skip hydration. We can quickly check this from the Angular documentation. Here you can see ngSkipHydration set to true. If I now go here, you can see that the products page is not hydrated at all in this particular example. Now we only have the app root and this being hydrated. And if I scroll down now, you can see starting heavy computation. You can see the placeholder right here, and then it goes ahead. Now we are actually going into the incremental hydration, which means that our page would be rendered with the main content and not placeholder. So when we view the source, we're not going to see a placeholder here. We're actually going to see the main content. So for incremental hydration, what this allows us to do is, instead of using the placeholder content being rendered, it essentially uses the main template content. This is the highlight of using incremental hydration. And what it allows us to do is that it's going to render the content on the server. The browser gets the HTML and it keeps the HTML as it is. So you can imagine having a static HTML being shown, and you can tell when it's going to be hydrated, which means that you can say to Angular, let's say on a timer of 5 seconds, then you hydrate that, which means that the component itself or the component's initialization code or the events that it's going to bind, all of those things are going to happen at a later time, which also means that now we are going to have even lesser bundle size. So imagine heavy components that you don't really want JavaScript to run for. They are still rendered on the server, but when they come to the browser does not load their JavaScript bundle or bind any event listeners, which means that it's going to be more performant. So initial load time is also reduced and initial bundle size is also reduced as well. Then according to your logic on how you trigger the incremental hydration, it's going to then run the JavaScript and it's going to render the component then. So what we could do technically is that I still want my products to be shown when I load the page, but I don't really want this heavy computation to run. So right now what happens is that the deferred content shows a placeholder. So it's going to continue to show a placeholder, so not rendering the products. But if I go down, it's going to first run the heavy computation and then it's going to render the HTML for me. It would be awesome if we still render the products even before this thing starts. And that's what we are going to do with incremental hydration. So how do we enable it? It's really cool and it's really easy. We go to our app config again, and in here we go and say with incremental hydration. But before doing so, I also want to show you something really cool. And that is, with incremental hydration, we have again triggers like defer. We have hydrate on, we have hydrate when, and we have hydrate never for completely static content, so to say. So how about we go and try incremental hydration, but I'm going to quickly try to see the hydrate trigger itself. So what we are going to do is I'm going to go to products HTML directly, and in here you can see that we said on viewport here, right? I'm going to actually change that. I'm going to say when we have products, we're going to render that. Okay. But right after, I'm going to say hydrate on viewport. I want to hydrate this when we have the viewport or when the user goes to the particular component. Now, the beautiful thing I wanted to show you is that Angular shows you the correct error pretty nicely. It says that Angular has detected that some defer blocks use hydrate trigger, which you can see right here, but incremental hydration was not enabled. So please ensure we are using with incremental hydration. So this is pretty cool. So I can go to app config TS, and here I can say with incremental hydration, and you have to of course import this from here from Angular platform browser. Once you save this, now we should be good. But sometimes it shows this error as well. I'm not really sure why. So I'm gonna quickly just restart ngserve with no HMR. Now I think we are good to go. So I'm gonna quickly save this and let's see what happens. Now, if I go to my browser, first I'm gonna show you what happens with the view source. If I refresh now, make sure that we have line wrap, boom, you can see that now we don't have a placeholder. We have actual products being rendered on the server. So the server renders the main content. Here you can see we have category electronics, we have the price right here, we have add to cart button, we have noise cancelling headphones with crystal clear sound, blah blah blah. So all the things that come from this data are essentially rendered right there on the server, which means that if I now go to my browser and if I refresh here, even without going to the viewport, I should have my elements being there, right? So if I go to the elements here, you can see that we have app root, we have main, we have products, and we have this section that contains the product list. But did you notice something interesting? If I go to console, you can already see that we have this heavy computation finished or started heavy computation. This means that this component was hydrated. But why did it hydrate when I said that it should not have been done until I have the viewport or until I scroll to this particular element. It got hydrated even before that. And the reason for that is perhaps that if I go to my code, we did something. We did say ngSkipHydration true. So I'm going to actually remove this to avoid any confusion. So now that we have removed that and we have the same thing here. So we have when and hydrate as well. Now I can go to my browser, and if I refresh now, let's see what happens. In this case, you can still see that we have the start heavy computation happening is still, and then the heavy computation finished. Now the reason for this is that we are having this deferred block inside our else case. Now let's see what happens if I take it outside. So I'm gonna basically cut this from here. I'm gonna take it outside, and here I'm gonna paste it. Now I'm gonna save this now, and you can see that this is outside of the else block. Now what I also want to show you is something interesting. We are actually going to go ahead and remove the heavy computation because I want to show something exciting. So if I go to the product list component, I'm actually going to remove this heavy computation, but I'm going to also go to products HTML, and I'm going to say the hydrate on will run on a timer. So I'm going to say timer 5 seconds, and we can essentially log something different here. So we can say console.log. Here we can say something like first render complete or something like this. If I save this, go to my browser, and here you can see that now it says first render complete, which essentially runs when after 5 seconds. So if I quickly refresh now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now you should be able to see this. Okay. So what would happen if the user before these 5 seconds actually went down and tried to add to cart? What would happen then? Well, I found it really exciting when I tried this out for the first time. And what happens is if I refresh now, go down quickly and click add to cart, it automatically works. This is brilliant. And I told them, the Angular team, that I really fell in love with this particular feature, because what happens is that behind the scenes, it uses something called event replay. And with event replay, what happens is that it captures automatically the action of the user, and then it replays that, because when the user actually clicked it, this was not hydrated, which means that the constructor did not run, which means that the ng on init did not run for these products, and there were no event bindings as well. But then Angular loads it, renders the component, binds the event listener, and looks at what events were fired before. And in our case, that was user clicking this particular button, and then it replays it. So we see the actual alert, and this is super cool. So I'm going to try this again because I actually like it. So I'm going to quickly go ahead. I'm going to click add to cart, and you can see it automatically says first render complete, and then also replays the event for us. And this event replay is not something that is just for incremental hydration, but with incremental hydration, this automatically uses it behind the scenes. But if you're not really using incremental hydration, you could still go to your code, go to config ts, and even without incremental hydration, you could run with event replay, and that would make it work for just the regular hydration or a full page hydration, so to say, with event replay. So even if the user clicks before the hydration is finished, it would still replay those events. But with incremental hydration, this is super cool. Now for the components that you want to always be static, no event bindings, they should not really work on the client, or they should not really have their bindings or their constructors run or hydrate on the browser, you could just use hydrate never. So I'm going to try this out with the products list component. And by that, I mean, I'm going to go to products.html here. I'm going to just say hydrate never, which essentially just makes this a static HTML. So if I go to my browser now, and if I go here, you're going to see that if I refresh now, it essentially just renders all my component. After the timer, it's not going to do anything because we don't have anything with the timer. And if I try to click add to cart, what happens then? Nothing, because this component is not hydrated at all. This just becomes a static HTML, which doesn't do anything. So if you have components which you have created, but they don't really do anything, or they don't have JavaScript associated to them and are just being used for example, just rendering some information or presenting some information that's not going to change, you can basically use hydrate never there. Now, with that said, the last thing that I want to look at is my code, because it looks a bit weird. We have a bunch of things here. We have this if condition for when the products is loading, which means that we have a JSON API call gone and it's loading. Then we show the loading indicator. Then if there's an error, we show the error. Else we don't really do anything at all in this particular case. But then we have this defer, which says when the product has value, then we show it, and we hydrate never. I'm going to actually remove this to say on viewport rather. But what I mean here is that, do I want the else block here? I don't think so. Do I want to remove these? Maybe not. Because in this particular case, the placeholder that we have here, you could actually use the loader right here until we have a value. If there's an error, then it's going to show the error, but this error cannot be loading of the error. So this is a bit tricky. So you would have to come up with a situation where you may have a combination of both. For me, right now, the code makes sense, because if it's loading, then it's going to render this. If it has error, then it's going to render the error. If it has data, which means it has value, and this is the HTTP resource that we are using. So if it has a value, then it's going to render this component. So you got to be a bit careful with this. And then you have the placeholder, the loading indicator, and the error. But for the bundle or for this component to render, this has nothing to do with the data that comes from the API call. So just know this particular distinction when you're actually working with the defer block versus your if else block for your data, so to say. And with that said, we actually come to the end of this particular video. This was an interesting deep dive for me. I actually scratched my head a couple of times while preparing for this, but I still hope that this brought clarity to you with the progression that we did from shifting one situation to another one. And we are not really ending here. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how can we render or pre-render information still with dynamic data. For example, if you had a bunch of products and you had product pages for each of those, how would you pre-render it rather than having a server-side render? And you can find the video, of course, right here to watch it. And you know what? There's a good news. My Angular Signals book is now available on Amazon, and I put my heart and soul into it, did a lot of work, also got a good reviewer, and finally it's available on Amazon. You can find the link in the description of this video. And if you're really interested in getting your Angular skills, especially the Signals APIs, to the next level, you have to get it. And let me know what your feedback is on the book if you already have one. And with that said, as always, happy coding. I'm going to see you next time.